King Charles and Princess Anne have suddenly become the center of a constitutional question that could change how Britain thinks about royal authority. If Charles were to make the extraordinary decision to place Anne in a formal royal regent role, the impact would go far beyond another royal title. It would raise a much bigger question: why would the king choose his sister, and what would that choice say about the future of the crown? For decades, Anne has occupied a unique position inside the monarchy. She is not the heir, she has never stood at the center of succession speculation, and she has generally avoided the kind of palace drama that surrounds the senior royals. Yet her record of duty has made her one of the most trusted working members of the family. That is precisely why a decision involving Anne could send such a powerful signal to the nation. That distinction is important because the idea of Charles granting Anne a royal regent title is best understood as a scenario and a constitutional possibility, not as an established fact. Existing law already provides mechanisms for temporary assistance when the monarch is absent or unable to carry out certain duties. Parliament expanded the pool of councillors of state in 2022, specifically adding Anne and Prince Edward to the list. Those existing arrangements provide the real foundation for understanding why Anne would be such a logical figure if the palace ever wanted to discuss a stronger temporary role. And this is where the headline becomes more interesting. The dramatic phrase is not really about a title, it is about trust. If Charles were to make a major constitutional move involving Anne, the message would be that he sees his sister as someone capable of protecting the continuity of the institution without turning that responsibility into a personal contest for influence. That would fit the image Anne has spent a lifetime building, even if the precise title suggested by the headline does not currently exist as a new office created by Charles. Before we get into the decision itself, tell me where you are watching from today. Which city are you watching from? Are you watching from London, Manchester, Birmingham, New York, Toronto, Sydney, or somewhere else? Tell me your city in the comments, because I want to see just how far this royal story has reached. And if you follow the British royal family closely, make sure you subscribe, because there is another important layer to this decision that we need to examine before the full picture becomes clear. For viewers who have followed the family for years, the choice would also feel emotionally logical. Charles and Anne grew up together inside a system that was already preparing them for very different futures. Charles was the heir. Anne was the younger sister who would never inherit the crown under the succession rules of her childhood. Yet the difference in their constitutional destinations did not prevent Anne from becoming one of the people Charles could rely upon most heavily. That work matters because a monarchy is not sustained by constitutional language alone. It survives through people who can perform the ordinary duties that keep the institution functioning. A sovereign can make speeches and hold audiences, but the wider royal structure depends on trusted members who can represent the crown, absorb difficult schedules, maintain relationships, and carry out responsibilities without constantly becoming the story themselves. Anne has spent decades demonstrating exactly that ability. The 2022 change to the Councillors of State arrangements is therefore central to the discussion. Parliament approved legislation that allowed Anne and Edward to serve as Councillors of State. The change was designed to strengthen the resilience of the constitutional system by adding working royals who could actually perform duties when required. It was not a declaration that Anne had become a regent, but it was a clear recognition that the monarchy needed a wider group of dependable people around the sovereign. That legal background changes the way a headline about a royal regent should be read. Instead of imagining Charles simply signing a paper and creating a new constitutional office overnight, the more realistic question is this: what additional responsibility could the existing system place in Anne's hands if circumstances required it? That is a question with real constitutional substance, because the Councillors of State mechanism already allows certain royal functions to be delegated under defined conditions. Under the existing framework, Councillors of State can carry out a range of official duties when authorized to do so. They can undertake functions such as attending Privy Council meetings and dealing with routine state business, although important constitutional limits remain. They cannot simply replace the monarch in every respect. Some of the most significant powers cannot be delegated in the ordinary way. That means a genuine regency and a temporary deputizing role are not the same thing. This is exactly why the idea of Anne becoming a formal regent would be so significant. A regency is not merely an honorary distinction. It raises questions about who exercises the sovereign's authority, under what legal conditions, for how long, and with what limits. Any serious move in that direction would require careful constitutional handling. The palace would have to work with government and parliament rather than presenting the matter as a private family decision. Yet the symbolism of Charles choosing Anne would still be powerful. It would tell the public that the monarch's most trusted support does not necessarily come from the person closest to him in a ceremonial sense. It can come from the person with the longest record of institutional service, the strongest reputation for discipline, and the least obvious personal incentive to turn delegated authority into a platform for herself. That last point is perhaps the most important. Anne has no realistic path to the throne. Her place in the succession is distant, and her public identity is overwhelmingly tied to service rather than ambition. That makes her unusually useful in a system where trust matters. A person who does not appear to be positioning herself for the crown can be easier to trust with temporary responsibility than someone whose every action could be interpreted as advancing a personal dynastic interest. The monarchy has learned repeatedly that titles can attract attention, while responsibility attracts scrutiny. A new title for Anne would immediately create questions. Would she outrank other working royals in practical authority? Would the role be temporary or permanent? Would it operate alongside the Prince of Wales? What would happen if Charles were merely traveling, briefly unwell, or unable to attend a particular engagement? And most importantly, would the title have legal force, or simply communicate a new internal hierarchy? Those questions are precisely what make the proposed decision such a strong subject for discussion. The public does not see the constitutional machinery every day. Most people see appearances, ceremonies, speeches, uniforms, processions, and family photographs. Behind those images sits a complicated system of laws, conventions, letters patent, ministers, advisors, and established procedures. The difference between ceremony and authority is therefore easy to miss until a change brings the hidden structure into view. Anne has spent much of her life operating comfortably on both sides of that divide. She understands ceremony because she has lived through more royal occasions than almost anyone else in the family. But she also understands practical work because she has spent decades traveling, meeting organizations, supporting causes, and representing the crown. That combination is unusual. It means she can move from a public ceremonial setting to a serious institutional discussion without needing to reinvent herself. Her relationship with Charles adds another layer. They were born less than 2 years apart and grew up under the same parents, the late Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. They experienced the same extraordinary family environment, the same transition from childhood to public duty, and the same long years of watching their mother carry the crown. Their paths diverged, but their shared history remained one of the strongest foundations available to Charles when he became king. That shared history matters during difficult periods. A monarch does not only need advisors who understand constitutional rules, he also needs people who understand the human being behind the institution. Anne knows Charles before the crown, before the coronation, before the palace machinery became the center of his life. She knows the family history without needing it explained. That can make private trust easier to maintain when public pressure becomes intense. It also explains why Anne's influence can be significant without being loud. She rarely needs to announce that she has entered a room with authority. Her credibility comes from repetition. She has shown up for years. She has accepted difficult assignments. She has continued working through changes in public opinion, family crises, leadership transitions, and the shrinking size of the working royal group. The comparison with other members of the family is unavoidable. Prince William is the heir, and therefore has an entirely different constitutional destiny. His future responsibilities are enormous, but that does not mean he should be expected to carry every temporary burden placed on the monarchy today. His role is also shaped by his family, his children, and the preparation required for eventually becoming king. Anne can provide support without competing with that future. Queen Camilla occupies another completely different position. As the king's wife, she is central to his personal and public life. But being queen consort does not automatically mean possessing the same constitutional authority as the sovereign. The distinction between proximity to the monarch and legal power is one of the easiest things for the public to misunderstand. A spouse can be extraordinarily influential without being authorized to exercise the crown's constitutional functions. That distinction is important because sensational royal coverage often turns every change in visibility into a battle for power. If Anne received a larger formal responsibility, it would not automatically mean Camilla had been defeated, removed, or humiliated. It could simply mean that different people were being used for different jobs. The monarchy often works through precisely that kind of division of labor, even when the public prefers a simpler story of winners and losers. Still, symbolism matters. If Charles appeared beside Anne while announcing a major constitutional adjustment, cameras would immediately focus on what the gesture said about trust. The public would compare it with previous decisions, previous roles, and previous moments when Anne was visibly placed close to the king. Every photograph would become evidence in a larger conversation about who sits at the center of the monarchy. The strongest evidence would not necessarily be the title itself. It would be what Anne was actually authorized to do. If she were asked to represent the sovereign in a wider range of constitutional settings, to chair important meetings, to receive senior officials, or to carry out specific functions during periods when Charles could not, then the substance of the move would become clearer. A title without legal responsibility would be mostly symbolic. Responsibility without a dramatic title could be much more consequential. That is why the existing Counselor of State role is so revealing. Anne already has a legal place within the machinery designed to help the sovereign when needed. The 2022 change was significant precisely because it recognized her as someone suitable for that responsibility. It also reflected a practical reality. A modern monarchy cannot depend on a handful of people when some are non-working royals, live abroad, or are otherwise unable to perform duties. The change was also a lesson in how the Constitution actually works. When the old arrangements no longer matched the practical needs of the institution, Parliament changed the law. The Crown did not simply improvise a solution in private. That is an important distinction for anyone following the current speculation. If Charles wanted a genuine regency, the root would have to respect the constitutional system rather than bypass it. The word regent itself carries historical weight. Britain has used regencies when a monarch was a minor or unable to rule. A regent effectively exercises the Crown's authority for a period defined by law. That is very different from being a senior working royal or a counselor of state. The title therefore creates expectations that would need to be matched by legislation and clearly defined powers. Imagine the palace announcing that Charles had chosen Anne for such a responsibility. The first reaction would be emotional. Supporters would describe it as recognition for decades of service. Critics would ask why the heir was not given the role. Constitutional experts would immediately examine the legal basis. Commentators would compare Anne with previous regents and ask whether the move represented a temporary emergency measure or a broader redesign of how the monarchy functions. The palace would then face a second challenge, explaining the decision without creating a family drama that did not exist. Royal institutions are particularly vulnerable to narratives about exclusion. If Anne received authority, people would ask whether someone else had lost it. If Camilla remained visible but outside the constitutional mechanism, commentators would ask whether she had been sidelined. If William supported the move, others would interpret that as evidence of a changing balance between generations. A careful explanation would therefore be essential. Charles would need to make clear that the role existed to protect the functioning of the crown, not to create a rival center of power. Anne would need to be presented as a servant of the institution rather than an alternative monarch. William would need to remain visibly secure in his position as heir. Camilla would need to remain visibly secure in her place beside the king. The success of the move would depend as much on those signals as on the legal language itself. This is where Anne's personality would become an advantage. She is not known for chasing the spotlight. Her public image is built around work rather than performance. That makes it easier to imagine her accepting responsibility without turning it into a personal brand. In an institution where every public gesture can become a headline, that kind of restraint can be more valuable than charisma. It is also consistent with the way Anne has approached the title Princess Royal. Queen Elizabeth II granted her that title in 1987. It is traditionally associated with the monarch's eldest daughter and is held for life. The title gave Anne a distinctive place in the royal family, but it did not turn her into a constitutional alternative to the sovereign. Instead, it reinforced the idea of lifelong service to the crown. That history makes the proposed phrase, royal regent title, especially interesting. Anne already has one of the most distinctive female royal titles in Britain. Adding a constitutional responsibility on top of it would not simply decorate her existing role. It would change how people understood the practical meaning of her position. The public would begin to see the Princess Royal not only as a senior working royal, but as part of the monarchy's emergency constitutional architecture. And there is a deeper historical irony. Anne was born under rules that placed her brothers ahead of her in the succession because of male preference. Those rules later changed, so younger brothers no longer automatically move ahead of older sisters. Anne's own place was shaped by the old system, yet her reputation was built by succeeding in the role she actually had, rather than complaining about the role she did not have. That makes her elevation symbolically powerful, even without changing the line of succession. She would not need a crown to become more important to the institution. Her influence could come from competence. In a period when the monarchy is trying to remain smaller, more efficient, and more credible, competence is a form of power that does not require a dramatic constitutional title. There is also the question of age and experience. Anne is older than the current generation of senior working royals, and has lived through several eras of British public life. She has seen the monarchy under Elizabeth II, through the transition to Charles, and into an era where William and Catherine are increasingly important to the institution's future. That perspective can be useful when decisions have consequences beyond the next news cycle. Charles may therefore have a practical reason to trust her. The Crown is a long institution, and its leaders sometimes need someone who remembers why certain conventions exist. Anne has lived through the history rather than studying it from a briefing paper. She knows how the palace changes under pressure, how public attention shifts, and how a small family system can become overloaded when too many responsibilities arrive at once. The idea also raises an important question about what the monarchy wants to become. Charles has spoken for years about a more streamlined institution. A smaller working group means every dependable member becomes more valuable. If the family has fewer people available for serious constitutional work, the remaining senior figures have to carry more responsibility. Anne is an obvious candidate because her working record is already established. This is why the headline can be understood as a symbol of a larger transition. It is not simply Charles giving Anne something, it is the monarchy deciding which qualities it needs most. In an earlier era, proximity, birth order, and ceremony could dominate the public image of royal importance. In a modern institution under pressure, reliability, experience, and public trust may matter more. The public response would likely reflect that shift. Anne has long benefited from an image that is unusually stable for a member of the royal family. Her reputation is not built around a single fashion moment, a single speech, or a single controversy. It comes from years of visible work that creates a kind of institutional credibility that is difficult to manufacture once a crisis arrives. Her supporters would therefore see a larger constitutional role as overdue recognition. They would argue that Anne has already demonstrated the qualities required for responsibility, so formalizing those qualities would simply match the law to the reality of her service. Critics, however, would ask whether the monarchy is concentrating too much authority in a small group of senior royals, and whether the public has been given enough information about the purpose of the change. Those criticisms would be healthy because constitutional power should never be treated as a family reward. If Anne were given a real regency function, the public would be entitled to know the legal basis, the limits, the duration, and the circumstances in which it could be used. The monarchy depends on confidence in rules as much as confidence in personalities. Even a highly respected figure must operate within those rules. The same principle applies to Charles. His authority comes from the constitutional settlement, not simply from personal popularity. If he wanted Anne to carry out responsibilities on his behalf, the legitimacy of that arrangement would come from law and convention. That is why the strongest version of this story is not a palace surprise in which Charles suddenly hands his sister the keys to the state. It is a carefully constructed decision that uses existing constitutional tools, or seeks lawful changes where those tools are insufficient. There is another reason the proposed move would attract attention: the memory of Queen Elizabeth II. Elizabeth relied heavily on trusted family members throughout her long reign, and Anne was one of the people who repeatedly demonstrated that she could represent the crown without making herself the center of attention. Charles inherited not only his mother's throne but also the institutional lessons of her reign. Elizabeth's example would make Anne's potential role feel less revolutionary than it first appears. The monarchy is always dependent on trusted relatives to carry difficult responsibilities. What would be different today is the formal constitutional environment, the reduced number of working royals, and the intensity of modern media scrutiny. A responsibility that once remained mostly behind the scenes would now be examined instantly by millions of people. That media environment is another reason the palace would need to be careful. A phrase such as royal regent would dominate coverage, while the actual legal explanation could disappear underneath it. Headlines would turn constitutional nuance into a contest between Charles, Anne, Camilla, and William. Social media would produce theories within minutes. Some would claim Anne had replaced Camilla. Others would claim Charles had lost confidence in William. None of those conclusions would necessarily follow from the underlying constitutional arrangement. The reality would be more technical and, in some ways, more interesting. The central issue would be continuity. What happens when a monarch cannot perform a duty? Who is legally able to act? Which functions can be delegated? Which cannot? How are those decisions authorized? How is accountability maintained? These are the questions that determine whether a monarchy is functioning as a constitutional institution rather than as a family business. Anne's presence in that system would also protect the monarchy from relying too heavily on one generation. William is the future, Charles is the present. Anne represents continuity between eras. She connects the long Elizabethan experience with the current reign without competing for the future. That makes her uniquely positioned to serve as a bridge when the institution is under pressure. It is easy to overlook how valuable that bridge can be. A monarchy has to preserve continuity while also changing. Too much continuity makes it look frozen. Too much change makes it look unstable. A figure like Anne can embody continuity without demanding that everything remain exactly as it was. Her very presence says that the institution can adapt while still respecting the traditions that shaped it. The same logic applies to the relationship between Anne and William. If Charles were temporarily unable to perform certain functions, William would remain the heir and would continue preparing for the future. Anne could absorb some immediate administrative responsibility without asking William to live permanently, as though he were already king. That division could be especially valuable during periods when the heir's family responsibilities are already significant. It would also allow William to focus on the long horizon. A future monarch needs time to build relationships, develop a governing philosophy, understand the changing public mood, and prepare for responsibilities that may last decades. If every temporary problem were placed on his shoulders, that long-term preparation could become harder. Anne's experience offers a practical buffer without challenging his constitutional position. Camilla's role would remain different. She would continue to be the king's wife and an important public figure, but a formal regency arrangement would not necessarily require her to exercise constitutional power. That distinction could actually reduce pressure on her. Instead of expecting the queen consort to become a substitute sovereign, the institution could assign specific duties to people with the appropriate constitutional status and experience. That would be a more mature way to understand the monarchy. Not every senior royal needs to perform the same function. Some provide public visibility, some provide diplomatic support, some carry charitable responsibilities, some serve in constitutional roles, some prepare for future reigns. The institution becomes stronger when those differences are recognized rather than turned into a constant competition for rank. The proposed title also raises the question of whether the monarchy needs new language for old responsibilities. The public understands words such as king, queen, prince, princess, and regent, but the modern constitutional system is more complicated than those labels suggest. Counselors of state already perform a defined form of delegated work. A new title could create clarity, but it could also create confusion if it suggested powers that the law did not actually provide. That is why experts would probably scrutinize every word. Would Anne be called regent, acting regent, royal regent, or something else? Would the role arise only after a formal declaration of incapacity? Would Parliament need to legislate? Would letters patent be enough for some functions but not others? Would the role end automatically when Charles resumed duties? Each question would have consequences, and none could be answered by royal symbolism alone. The public would also want to know whether Anne herself wanted such a responsibility. Her career suggests that she accepts duty when it is required, but that does not mean she seeks constitutional prominence. In fact, one of the reasons she is trusted is that she has rarely behaved as though royal status were something to be accumulated. She has treated responsibility as work, not as a prize. That attitude would be crucial if Charles ever asked her to take on a larger role. The strongest version of the decision would not present Anne as suddenly becoming more ambitious. It would present her as accepting an obligation because the institution needed someone capable of carrying it. That is a much more credible story, and it is consistent with the public image she has built over decades. It also explains why the idea of Anne as a regent feels different from the idea of another royal receiving a new title. With Anne, the question is less about whether she deserves attention and more about whether the Constitution can use the experience she already possesses. Her record makes the hypothetical move plausible as a discussion even if the specific title remains legally uncertain. The larger lesson is that royal power is rarely as simple as the photographs suggest. The person standing next to the king may not be the person who can perform a particular constitutional function. The person with the grandest title may not be the person carrying the most practical workload. And the person with the most public attention may not be the person the institution trusts most when something serious has to be handled quietly. That is where Princess Anne has always been different. Her authority has accumulated almost invisibly. It has come from reliability, not from constant announcements. It has come from being present when other people were absent. It has come from doing work that does not always produce spectacular headlines but becomes essential when the family needs someone dependable. If Charles were to formalize that trust through a major constitutional appointment, the moment would therefore represent more than a personal gesture between siblings. It would be a statement about what the monarchy values: experience over novelty, duty over spectacle, institutional continuity over personal ambition, and perhaps most importantly, competence over noise. There would still be controversy. Any change involving the crown creates controversy because the monarchy itself is a subject of public debate. Some would ask whether the institution should exist at all. Others would argue that a smaller monarchy should avoid creating new titles. Some would welcome a practical solution while warning against giving unelected figures too much authority. Those arguments would not disappear simply because Anne is popular, but the constitutional question would remain separate from the political argument about monarchy itself. If the institution continues to exist, it must have rules for moments when the sovereign cannot perform every duty. Those rules have to be clear, lawful, and adaptable. The 2022 changes demonstrated that Parliament can adjust the system when the existing framework no longer matches practical reality. A future change could follow the same principle if circumstances demanded it. That is why the phrase King Charles stuns the nation with shocking decision to grant Princess Anne royal regent title is best treated as a dramatic description of a possible constitutional direction, rather than a statement that a new office has already been created. The underlying question is real. How would the monarchy use Anne's experience if Charles needed additional support? The answer begins with the powers she already holds and the constitutional limits around them. And if the palace ever did announce a formal regency arrangement involving Anne, the first few minutes would be watched closely. The king would be judged not only by what he granted his sister, but by how clearly he explained the legal basis. Anne would be judged by how she accepted the responsibility. William would be watched for signs of support. Camilla would be watched for her reaction. The entire family would become part of the constitutional message, whether they wanted to or not. The most powerful image might not be a crown, a ceremony, or a dramatic announcement. It might be Charles and Anne standing together, presenting the decision as a practical measure for the continuity of the crown. In that image, the brother who inherited the throne would be acknowledging the sister who spent her life serving it without expecting to inherit it herself. That would give the decision an emotional dimension that constitutional documents cannot provide. Charles and Anne have lived through the same family history from different positions. He became the sovereign. She became the princess royal. One carries the crown directly. The other has spent decades carrying its obligations without wearing it. There is something fitting about that distinction. The monarchy often talks about service as though it were an abstract ideal, but Anne's career has made it visible. She has demonstrated that influence does not always require a throne. It can be built through consistency, discipline, and the willingness to accept responsibilities that do not produce personal glory. If that is what Charles saw when considering Anne for a stronger constitutional role, then the decision would make sense as part of a wider strategy. It would not be about creating another royal superstar. It would be about strengthening the machinery behind the crown with someone who already understands how that machinery works. The question of whether such a role should actually be created would remain for constitutional experts, ministers, and parliament. The law would determine what is possible. Convention would determine how it is implemented. Public confidence would determine how it is received. And the royal family would have to live with the consequences long after the first headlines disappeared. That final point is important because royal decisions rarely end when the announcement ends. A title can last for decades. A constitutional precedent can influence future reigns. A new responsibility can become normal once people see it working. If Anne were ever placed in a formal regency position, the decision could therefore shape not only Charles's reign, but the way future monarchs think about temporary delegation of royal authority. It could also become part of William's inheritance. The future king would observe how his father used his sister, how the constitutional system responded, and how the public reacted. He would learn not only from Charles's successes, but from the practical problems created by any new arrangement. In that sense, Anne's role could become a bridge between two reigns in a very literal constitutional sense. For Anne herself, however, the title would probably be less important than the work attached to it. Her career suggests that she is most comfortable when the task is clear. She does not need elaborate language to demonstrate commitment. Give her a responsibility, define the objective, and she is likely to focus on getting the job done. That is precisely why a formal appointment could be both surprising and completely consistent with the woman the public has watched for decades. The monarchy may ultimately decide that no new regent title is necessary. Existing councillors of state arrangements may remain sufficient. Charles may continue to rely on a combination of family support, ministers, and established constitutional mechanisms. That would not diminish Anne's importance. It would simply mean that her influence continues through the roles already recognized by law. But if circumstances ever required more, Anne would be one of the first names many observers would expect to appear in the conversation. She already occupies a constitutionally relevant position. She already has the king's trust. She already has decades of experience. And she already possesses something that cannot be created by legislation: credibility earned over a lifetime. That is ultimately what makes the idea so compelling. The headline sounds like a sudden transfer of power, but the deeper story is almost the opposite. Anne's potential importance has been building slowly for decades. The title would be new only in the sense that it would give formal language to a level of trust that her career has already demonstrated. So if Charles ever stood beside Anne and announced a decision that placed her in a formal regency role, the nation would not simply be watching a brother give his sister a title. It would be watching the British monarchy reveal how it intends to survive pressure, illness, changing family structures, and the demands of modern constitutional life. And perhaps the most striking part would be who Charles chose. Not someone competing for the throne. Not someone trying to dominate the headlines. Not someone whose value depends on novelty. He would be choosing a woman whose public identity has been built on the simplest royal principle of all: show up, do the work, and keep going. For decades, Anne has been one of the monarchy's quiet constants. Her importance has rarely needed to be explained because it has been visible in the calendar, the engagements, the overseas visits, the organizations she supports, and the trust placed in her by successive generations of the family. A formal constitutional role would make that quiet importance impossible to overlook. Whether the phrase royal regent ever becomes a legal reality is another matter. The Constitution would have to decide that, not a headline. But the question behind the headline is worth asking because it exposes something fundamental about the crown. When a monarch cannot do everything, the survival of the institution depends on knowing exactly whom to trust and exactly what the law allows them to do. And on that question, Princess Anne has spent an extraordinary lifetime building the strongest possible answer. She has no need to prove that she can work. She has no need to prove that she understands duty. She has no need to prove that she can stand beside the crown without trying to become the crown. Those are the qualities that make the hypothetical decision so powerful. So the real shock would not be that Charles trusted Anne. The monarchy has been showing that trust for years. The real shock would be if the institution finally gave that trust a constitutional form large enough for the entire country to see it. That would turn decades of quiet service into one of the most visible statements of royal confidence in the modern era. And if that moment ever comes, the public will have every reason to look beyond the title and ask the harder questions. What powers does Anne actually have? Who authorized them? How long do they last? What remains with the king? What remains with the Prince of Wales? How does the arrangement protect the Constitution? Those questions would matter more than the excitement of the announcement. The constitutional reality remains the strongest part of the discussion. Anne already has a recognized place within the system, and any larger role would have to be created or activated through lawful procedures. That means the future of this question will not be decided by a headline alone. It will be decided by necessity, legislation, constitutional convention, and the judgment of the people responsible for keeping the crown functioning when circumstances become difficult. That is why Anne's record of service matters beyond ceremony as well. The constitutional question would remain open, but the principle would be clear. Trust, continuity, and responsibility would stand at the center of any future decision.